the empire of lies that has been constructed over the last 3.5 years by the West to try and justify this pointless, destructive war against Russia at the expense of Ukraine and its people is beginning to crumble. And I think it's going to begin crumbling faster and faster with each passing week in the near future, because the situation in Ukraine has reached a point where even the most skillful liar in Washington, London, Paris, or Berlin cannot conceal reality from the public. The Ukrainian military is falling apart. It's disintegrating. Senior officers are surrendering along with thousands of their men. There is now, I'm told, open discussion about turning on Kiev and Ukrainian troops actually moving on the city to rid themselves of Zelensky and his corrupt government. So I'm not sure that any of the fanciful ideas about achieving peace through some sort of agreement that Washington hammers out and eventually gets the support of the Europeans for is any longer realistic or even relevant. I think events are outpacing the West's ability to keep up with them. So at this point, I always go back to the obvious and most intelligent solution from the very beginning, which was the Austrian State Treaty. The Austrian State Treaty was not worried about deterring anything. The Austrian State Treaty was a solemn obligation to divorce itself from NATO, to prevent any foreign forces from establishing themselves on Austrian territory, and maintaining a force that was required for Austria's security and internal stability, and not much more. That worked out very well. And I don't think the Soviets subsequently had any interest in going back into Austria. And frankly, I think at some point we'll go back and revisit the situation or conditions in the 50s, and people may rethink a lot of the decisions were made at that point that might have rescued Germany from being split for all those decades. I mean, we just don't know. I'm sure at some point we'll get a look at what's in the archives in Moscow, and we'll probably learn more about what was said here. But my point is, this war in Ukraine is ending. Things are crumbling. The whole fabric of deceit, which is deeply embedded in the West, is going out of existence. All of the politicians that have been handsomely rewarded financially for maintaining the fiction that there was a war being fought in Ukraine against an aggressive, dangerous Russia is vanishing, because Russia has no interest in war with us, never did. The real question is going to be, what are America's interests? At some point, we have to answer that question. We've acted as though our interests are whatever we say this week. But I think what's going to happen in answer to your larger question is that people are going to say, wait a minute, we have one interest right now in Central East Europe. That interest is preeminently to restore good relations with Moscow. Because if you cannot build a better relationship with Moscow, then I think you're going to have difficulty maintaining security in Europe. I think that's the real realization that's dawning, and I think eventually the Alternative für Deutschland will come to power in Berlin, and they understand that. And they want to get out of this sort of tar pit, which we find ourselves in as a result of lying ourselves into this war. So
what he's really saying is that the narrative holding this war together is collapsing faster than the West can spin it. Ukraine's military is breaking down, political support is fading, and even Europe is starting to admit that the only path to real security runs through rebuilding ties with Moscow.
Globalists that are ruling Europe want desperately to justify their existence and to perpetuate their power. If you admit that the war in Ukraine is lost, that you have no means of changing that outcome, and that ultimately you should focus on the restoration of your own economic productivity and prosperity, you're not going to retain power. You're going to be removed, because the populations in these countries are already concluding they don't want to fight a war with Russia. I mean, this is why when I listen to these ridiculous remarks, I always say, well, what about all of the recruiting stations that are being set up in Oslo, Stockholm, Amsterdam, Berlin, and the tens of thousands of volunteers rushing to join the military for the Great Crusade against Russia? Well, I don't see it. Do you? I don't see any evidence for that showing up. I don't see any appetite for it at all. I think it's all nonsense. When this sinks in, people like Callas, who is running all over the place talking about the war in Ukraine will end when all the Russians leave Ukraine. She's a fool, and she's a laughingstock. It's going to take time for it to sink in, but it's beginning. We're at the beginning of this process, and the Russians don't need to lift a finger. All these governments will be removed. They will go out of business because they cannot sustain themselves on the basis of these lies. Again, it's the empire of lies is crumbling. That's the real success story for the Russians in eastern Ukraine, because the Russians have no interest in marching any further west. Who in their right mind wants to take over anything today in Europe, let alone western Ukraine? It's an enormous burden. There's no advantage to it. There are no great resources to be acquired, and the populations there are troublesome. So why would anybody want to do it? I just don't think that is sunk in completely, but I think it's beginning.
He's pointing out something simple but powerful. If European leaders admit this war is unwinnable, they lose their entire justification for staying in power, and the public already wants nothing to do with fighting Russia. Once that reality fully sinks in, these governments won't fall because of Moscow, they'll fall because their own people stop believing the lies.
There's a much higher probability in the near future of seeing Polish and German soldiers and police rounding up and forcibly deporting Ukrainians than there is of any war fighting against Russia. I think the Poles and the Germans are both fed up with all these young Ukrainian men that are sustaining themselves at the expense of the Polish and German governments, and they'd like them to go away. They'd like them to go home. So I think that's much more likely in the short term than anything else. Now, there is a concern that certain elements of Ukraine, and I'm talking about small numbers, could launch terrorist attacks in Germany and Poland and France and Great Britain and other countries in retribution for what they feel is their betrayal. I mean, that's not impossible. But that just reinforces the need to deport the Ukrainians. And frankly, if you don't deport these Ukrainians and send them back home when this terrible war finally comes to a conclusion, I don't think Ukraine will survive. It needs manpower. It needs Ukrainians to come back and repopulate that which turns out to be Ukraine. And I don't know what that looks like. But with each passing day, it looks to me as though the map that was devised by Medvedev looks more and more appealing, because it means a large chunk of this thing called Western Ukraine is somehow or another annexed by or confederated with Poland.
He's making a blunt point. Europe is far more likely to push Ukrainians out than fight Russia. Public frustration is rising, resources are strained, and governments know Ukraine needs its own people back if it's going to survive at all. The real conflict ahead won't be on a battlefield. It'll be over who stays in Europe and who gets sent home.
Disintegration of the European Union and the disintegration of NATO. Those things are on the table. It was interesting. Earlier today, I was listening to Rubio, the so-called Secretary of State, who doesn't seem to spend much time being Secretary of State, and is also the National Security Advisor and running the National Security Council staff in the White House. And he was insisting that the Europeans were ungrateful and unworthy of our support because they were complaining about the potential use of American military power against Venezuela, but they were happy to see us use Tomahawk missiles and other weapons against the Russians in Ukraine. It's a rather strange juxtaposition, because you're talking about two parts of the empire of lies. The notion that Venezuela anyway threatens us, no. Venezuela is a big drug hub, no. Ukraine is not a vital strategic interest for the United States, never was, never will be. The best that we could hope for in Ukraine was an early end of the conflict and the restoration of some measure of political, economic, and social stability in that country. That was always the interest that we had. The Europeans, and unfortunately people in Washington who were also part of the globalist camp, saw the war in Ukraine as an opportunity to destroy Russia, to harm Putin, just as foolish people in Washington are looking at the opportunity to remove Maduro, as though removing him will solve a problem for us anywhere in Venezuela. It won't. You know, when you begin trying to remove governments, you begin trying to destroy stability and order in any nation, regardless of whether you like it or not, you take enormous risks. And that's what we did in Ukraine, and now we're about to pay the price. And I don't think there's going to be much money left over for anyone. I don't think the Europeans are going to get the hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars from the Russians that they want. They want to steal from the central bank in Brussels. I don't think that's going to work. And I think the sooner Ukraine falls apart, the sooner this war comes to an obvious conclusion, the less likely the Europeans are to take the risks associated with taking the money that belongs to Russia and redistributing it to organized crime in Western Ukraine, which is effectively what you've got right now. Ukraine is an organized crime state. It's not a viable nation state any longer. So I wish people would stop talking about the stupid things and begin asking the question, how do we bring this to a rapid close so that we can begin the process of restoring some measure of order and stability to this place we called Ukraine? Nobody seems to want to go there. And if that's true, then Medvedev's map is the most likely outcome, because the Russians aren't going to wait around for the rest of us to make decisions about what we will or won't support in Ukraine, because they too have an interest in stability in Ukraine. They want an end to this thing. They'd like to get back to some reasonable commercial relationship, not just with Ukraine, but also with Poland, Germany, and the rest of Europe. So they'll move on their own. That's why I think all this discussion right now in the Trump administration is all irrelevant. Because from the beginning, Donald Trump, regardless of what he says, he wants something to happen because he wants to be at the center of it. He's very big into what we refer to loosely as optics. He wants to be the center. He wants to be worshipped. He wants to be glorified as the great man who brought peace. The problem is he's done the opposite. He joined the very people that he condemned and criticized while he was running for president. There's no difference between his administration and Blinken and the rest of these people and what they did under Biden. So right now, what does it all mean? I think, again, with each passing day, the empire of lies crumbles. Eventually, it's all going to come out. It's all going to look bad. And it's going to have an impact at the voting booth, at the ballot box, if not earlier than that in the streets.
He's saying the EU and NATO are weakening because their policies were built on illusions, and now those illusions are collapsing. The West tried to reshape Ukraine and Venezuela for its own agenda, but instead created chaos. And as the truth comes out, the political fallout will hit both Europe and Washington hard.
The military establishment you have, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out that most of what we've got and the way we're organized to fight, the structure of warfare, the paradigm of warfare, all of that has changed. Now, who is organized and prepared to fight differently in the future from the way we fought in the past? Quick answer is Russia. Are we? No, we're not. We're a long way from that. It's going to take time. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, when word reached Berlin and Vienna, Austria, in 1815, that Napoleon Bonaparte had landed, had come back from Elba, and was on his way to Paris, there were 140,000 Germans lined up to volunteer to fight in the Prussian army. They could not take all the volunteers that were willing to fight. The Austrians were experiencing something similar, but it was taking them longer. The Austrians have never been as efficient as the Germans. So they were going to raise an army of 300,000. Ultimately, we know what happened, Waterloo and that campaign and so forth, and Bonaparte never had much of a chance of retaining his position as it turned out anyway. But my point is, what was the difference? Everyone was prepared to volunteer and fight against another French invasion. Why? because the French had invaded. They'd raped, they'd plundered, they'd pillaged. There was deep-seated animosity and antipathy, not just for the French, but for this man Napoleon that had unleashed hell on Europe for years. That doesn't exist right now in any of the capitals of Europe or in any of the populations. And this Russian army, if nothing else has become clear during this war, despite the lies told about it, this Russian army bears no resemblance to the Soviet armies of the Second World War. They have not behaved like the Soviet armies at all. If anything, they have a closer relationship with Tsarist Russia, which was hardly perfect.
He's highlighting that Europe has no real will to fight Russia, no hatred, no fear, no public support, and Russia's modern military isn't the brutal Soviet force people imagine. The West is preparing for a war nobody wants, while Russia is adapting for the kind of warfare that's actually coming.
European people, they want to live in a peaceful, orderly environment. They want to be able to have their countries and live in those countries as they would prefer. They're not interested in being dictated to by von der Leyen or anybody else in Brussels. They don't want it, and they shouldn't have to put up with it. But they do need security, and each man's view of security is going to be a little different, and so I think you end up with regional organizational constructs that fit the needs of the people in a particular region. I mean, if you go back far enough in European history, go back to 1866, and that's why Bismarck fought against the dismemberment of Austria-Hungary. He said there's no better solution right now to the problems of the peoples that live in Central East Europe than the Habsburg Empire. He said, so we may not like it, but it's better than the alternative, which could be chaos. Well, I think you're going to have a similar conclusion emerge somewhere along the line among Europeans. What are we going to do instead of NATO? Now, the other thing to keep in mind is there's no one with any foresight or vision in Washington at all. So just write it off. There's no one who thinks in terms of what the future could look like and where we might fit in. Americans can always support and assist the Europeans in devising a different future, but we should not lead it. So if you were really interested, at least temporarily, suspending the dissolution of NATO, what should happen in Washington is very simply, President Trump should say, we need a European in charge militarily, and we need a European in charge as the Secretary General. We are going to back out of those roles. That doesn't mean we're leaving 100%, but it means that we should not lead you into the future. Europe must find its own future. And that includes something other than NATO, a different kind of security relationship. But I don't see anybody in Washington thinking about that. Washington is a reactionary Austria in the 1840s, clinging to its empire, trying to beat down any opposition to change. That's what Washington is. Washington is not Prussia, and it's not Prussia-Germany. It is not the cohesive, stable state that Prussia-Germany was. We're more like Austria-Hungary now. We are a collection of minorities, and all of them are screaming for power, control, and influence. We're trying to manage that, which is about all that we can do at this point. But instead of coming to terms with what we should do at home, we are out smashing anything and anyone, anywhere, who seems to challenge our dominance, our hegemony. That's the problem. I mean, the whole fight right now, financially and economically in the world, is to preserve the dollar-based system. All the billionaires that surround Donald Trump right now and are dominating our political life, they have become billionaires as a result of this financial system that emerged after the Second War. Only we've moved from a productive capitalist model to a highly financialized capitalist model where nobody produces anything. We just...
He's saying Europeans want stability, not Brussels telling them how to live, and without real leadership in Washington or Europe, NATO's future is fading fast. People will eventually demand new security arrangements that actually fit their needs, not outdated systems held together by politics and powerful elites.